Welcome to the Young CPA Success Show. If you're a young accounting professional, this podcast is your ultimate guide to navigating your early career. Join us as we share valuable insights, expert advice, and practical tips to help you kickstart your path to success and excel in the accounting industry. Let's embark on this exciting accounting journey together.
Okay, Hannah, so one of the themes that we've talked about a lot on the show has been growth and learning and those types of things, and how to create the right mindset for growth and understanding and maturing in your accounting career. So I thought it would be a fun intro today to talk a little bit about some lessons that we learned. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to start with a story.
Got it.
So there was a guy that I used to know, and he's unfortunately passed away a number of years ago, but he was kind of my first mentor. And he had these little things. His name was Ralph, and we called him Ralphisms. And he was super cheesy, super corny, like dad jokes galore. But when he started thinking a little bit about his lessons that he would teach you, I at least started to realize oh, this really isn't about what you're telling me. This is a different type of story. And so he was, again, my first mentor, and we spent a lot of time playing golf together. He was a very avid golfer, and I was kind of coming up through the junior ranks. And so we played a lot of golf together, and he'd always tell me, Joey, it costs the same whether you eat it or not, right? Which that's an opportunity cost lesson. He talked a lot about, how to not be a hero and stuff. Like sometimes you just got to chip out into the middle of the fairway instead of trying to be the hero. So he had all these wonderful little sayings that he would say to me, and he would kind of mention as ways to live my life. And I found myself thinking a lot about Ralph in this conversation that we had today with Chris Papin about how the psychology of change management and being okay with change. And a lot of it, in my mind, went back to what sort of mindset are you putting yourself into when you're coming to work every day and dealing with changing environments or difficult clients or conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that could be a challenge sometimes, given just things that are going on in your personal life, things that are going on in our clients' personal lives, sometimes that feed into how we approach our clients and just our day in general. Thinking back to just lessons learned and just little tidbits, I feel like for me, it really started whenever I was working as a teenager, even with my grandmother. She managed a check cash advance and title loan company in my hometown. And through there, we saw people in every walk of life, like realistically come in. And it really was my first just eye-opening experience. Obviously, working with the general public was a beast in and of itself, but it was an opportunity where she really instilled in me that you never know what people are going through. You never know what people are going through. So in terms of how you present yourself to them, it's just so important to show up positive, to show up kind, to just put forth the best that you can, because you just don't know what's going on in the background. And I feel like that's just the position that I've taken with my clients. I feel like it came up in that concept came up in a story that you'll hear in the podcast episode itself. It has shown up in how I show up every single day to work too. And it affects how I embrace change, and change being not just big life change, but change in how I think a day is going to go, change in how I think a client conversation is going to go. And just, it's really shaped a lot of those concepts for me, not just in work, but in life in general too.
Yeah. I think my big takeaway from today as well is, the only thing that we know for certain is that where we are today is not where we're going to be tomorrow. Change is inevitable. And so much of how you respond to change is going to be how you set yourself up to respond to that change. And I think Chris had some really good insights that you will hear in the show as well, about some psychological reasons about why we feel that way. And then hopefully some good tips and tricks about how to prepare yourself to move away from what we think of as accounting, right? Like, oh, I can do a bank rec, I can do journal entries, I know what AR aging means. Getting out of that mindset and into that advisor mindset, if that's the path that you want to go, this is the episode for you to pay attention to, because he gives some really good tidbits about that. I know you mentioned in your kind of bio link there that you wanted to talk a little bit about change management psychology 101, which I think is a really, really interesting topic, because I'm a creature of habit. Yeah. I think a lot of people get into accounting because we like structure, we like systems, we like processes. We feel really comfortable. I'll never forget this. The first tax season I worked, I did a little bit of a, your typical like 1040 work, and I did some business, 1120s, some simple business returns. And someone asked me, like, which one do you like better? And I said, well, I really like business returns, because at the end of the day, on a business return, I've got a trial balance, and that trial balance is going to balance. And then there's a Schedule L, or should be, on my tax return. And those two things should tie. And if they do, then I'm probably pretty close. I liked having an answer. I didn't like the opportunity on an income tax return if I transpose a number. Yeah. There's no red flag saying, hey, you're off by, $81. It's just the way it is. So I love this idea of getting comfortable with change. Mm-hmm. So I've done a lot of talking. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter first.
Same. Where I try to come from, kind of the platform I sit on, is the only true habit is change. Mm-hmm. I get, and I think just like you do in the sense of the balance sheet analogy, there's a lot of what I will call technicians that I think sit in that same seat. And if a client would just clearly tell us what the expectation is, we could execute. But reality is it's a changing expectation in a changing game with changing software. Either step up to the plate and begin to figure it out, lean into it is a practice of, not a perfection of, or go over into whatever silo it is that you choose to be inside of. But what's popular in our industry and with clients is the forward-looking advisory space, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's change all day, every day. So mm-hmm. I always try to talk folks through like the psychology piece of it. Our limbic system is designed first with fight or flight in mind. This is just how biology works. So pretend there's like a data cloud above me. That's the data we work with. When it hits our head, we're programmed to hit fight or flight. That's the emotional function first. Then we process with logic. And mm-hmm. I'm not here to say I've got any of that figured out, but what I am here to say is that's real life. Our clients behave that way. Our colleagues mm-hmm. behave that way. Everybody, even AI to some extent, kind of behaves in that way, because sometimes it spits out what it thinks is the correct answer. No different than a client reacting with emotion. And you've got to massage and get to the end result. So I hope I gave you kind of the global of where I sit with it. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, but it's just a constant manipulation to make sure we're all looking towards the same goal at the same time in the same place.
And this is so global across everything that we do in our field, even from how the landscape of the industry has changed. You spoke a little bit to that in terms of with the advisory piece. Like that wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. Maybe we started to see a small shift. I'm going to speak to a group of accountants in November, and part of it is on the skills gap in young accountants that we see. And I actually added to my list a couple of weeks ago, change management as one of the skills gaps that I'm seeing, because there have been so many times throughout my career, if I'd have had at least just a basis of understanding, a basis of acknowledgement, anything that would help me just wrap my head around and be prepared for what I was going to face throughout my career. Because it has changed so much. Like change is the one thing that we can guarantee. In this industry, in this life in general. So like, tell me a little bit about like where this platform came from for you.
A lot of it is built from, I don't know any other way. My mom is a counselor and has all kinds of different certs that go with this. So my running joke is like she's got all but like 4 letters of the alphabet behind her name. Right. But the reality inside of that is when you represent small businesses and small business owners, I deal with this all day, every day. So the other fun analogy is like she had the emoji chart, like the happy faces, growing up as a kid, like, how do you feel today? She was dealing with emojis before they were called emojis. I hated it then. I love it now because of exactly what you're illustrating. And you are 1,000% correct. Sitting in the seat of an advisor, what do you do when the client throws a curveball? What do you do when? And I'm overgeneralizing, and I am one of, so I can make fun of, but we just want the data so we can click the buttons and spit out the balance sheet that balances.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what the client wants. They want the conversation in between. So bridging that is so incredibly important. And my sarcasm, I was grabbing this a minute ago, if you saw my head bouncing around it. If we cannot do it on this cell phone, we don't want to do it as a client. They don't want to sit in front of a PC and log in, or a Mac, or whatever it is. I want to do it on the cell phone, on the fly, on the go. And oh, by the way, TikTok is probably better, or my neighbor gives me probably better advice than my advisor. Man, that's a tough spot to live in.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole concept of how do you have intelligent conversations with those wild cards at play? Not that they don't trust you, but it always starts with, well, my neighbor said, and you're like, I told you 3 years ago the same thing, but you didn't believe me. There's an emotional element inside of that where sometimes, at least for me, I won't speak for you guys, but sometimes I feel a little bit offended that the person presenting at a conference that concluded with, but please check with your CPA, is the expert on this. Really? So again, I kind of setting the stage there, but I think we've got to be nimble. We've got to be willing to just have the space to have the unknown conversation, which flies in the face of efficiency and checklists and all of that fun stuff, right?
Well, and I think the challenge there, I think sometimes you need both, right? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I've talked about a lot with as we're coaching up our CFOs is, I like to say it's I use the house analogy, right? The checklists and the process and the procedure, that's the foundation upon which you can start having those nimble type things. I know, speaking on the fly, whenever I'm working with a client in the CFO perspective, I feel a million times more prepared to be able to have those agile conversations if I know, okay, the CFO, my senior's got a checklist. Like, I know that we've hit all these boxes. We've looked at deferred rev. We've looked at payroll liabilities. We've reconciled the banks. We've done all of the nuts and bolts, the things that make us feel like good accountants. Like, hey, we checked off the box. We're moving down the procedure. Great. That's moving into kind of what we would like to call the table stakes here. Like, that's the requirement.
Yeah.
And those are the types of things, if I'm putting on my forward thinking hat a little bit, those are the types of functions that are going to get more routinely outsourced overseas or will eventually be taken over by AI. So looking at it from that perspective, if you want a future in this, in this career, getting used to having those higher level conversations is the only way forward in my mind.
Oh, I'm right with you.
I don't see another future outside of it.
It's funny. We had the conversation with a client the other day. Did the plan come first or did the financial statements come first? Awkward pause here, right? But as I talked through it, they kept telling me the plan came first. I said, that's interesting. What was the plan based on? More flexibility, more revenue, more net income, better tax deferral. And this was an entrepreneur who was in an organization, left, went out on their own. So again, which came first, the plan or the financials? They're so interwoven, you have to have both, which is what I think your illustration is, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's kind of like you can't, it's the chicken or the egg question asked a different way, where it's like intentionally, by definition, you don't have an answer because one, they have to happen in tandem.
Yeah. It's a scary space sometimes if people don't recognize that. AI is popular, so I like to use it, but junk in, junk out.
Right.
This guy I was teasing and was like, hey, if you don't have taxable income, a tax plan doesn't matter. Like, your tax is zero. Well, I always want it to be zero. He didn't take the bait, but I was like, well, I'll make my fees contingent upon whatever your profit is, and I'll make your tax zero every single year. He didn't, for some reason, he didn't like that. But those are the kinds of things where I think expectation and reality have to be based on truth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what's that truth? Mm-hmm. He was thinking cash flow. He doesn't have any money in his bank account. Profit and loss says something different. So therein lies another conversation. But how do you become nimble? And he did the right thing. He was trying to avoid debt and pay as he went. He just didn't understand that the things that he bought had a depreciable life that's a little different than expense. So it was a good conversation, but it's a small microcosm of finance folks see life differently. And whether you're the CFO running a big ship or you're the one-man band, the finance people see the actual math. And I think a lot of business owners, entrepreneurs, just we're focused on dollars available to do the next thing. They'll deal with what happened.
And they're just the visionary out there casting the vision for like what they want in the future and what they want to build. And like, we need to like kind of like rein them back in, like, whoa, back up. Like, let's talk about this. I've had that conversation with many of my clients. I feel like these conversations though are a muscle that I've had to build over time. It is not something that I came into my career just automatically being able to like walk into a room or have that conversation with my clients. It's something that's just taken reps over time. If somebody's listening to this and they're like, okay, I hear you. I need to get better at that. And I need to really stretch and expand myself into this space. Like, what steps would you suggest that somebody take? Like, where do they even start?
Man, that's a great question. So I would probably give the 3 avenues. One is something that you're probably already doing. You're investing in time spent on a podcast like this one. Getting ideas from other folks, looking at how they approach things, kind of this apprenticeship type approach. Just be in the room, pay attention, be present. Another extreme, you can use books, or Audible can be an option, but learning through there's all kinds of different, these don't have to be business specific books, go back to my mom analogy from a minute ago. It could be psychology that you go apply in the workplace or something along those lines.
Yep.
So I think you got to get outside of like, oh, hey, I've got to craft myself as a technician to have a different set of tools in the toolbox. And then the third, which is probably the hardest one, is go do it. Go do it. Go do it. And one of the things I like to share with my clients, especially when we're new in the process, is I should be in a different trust level than a lot of your other conversations. If you're scared to tell me something, I can't be the full representative you want me to be. So sometimes we got to get judgment out. Building that trust takes a lot of time. So it's hard to, hey, thanks for signing the engagement letter. Please trust me now. It doesn't work like that. But if I lean into the conversation and acknowledge you should be able to disagree with me or be mad at me, and we hug it out at the end and professionally continue to work together, that's okay. That's expected. Because if we can't have the hard conversations, what the heck are we doing? Because I guarantee you it's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows. That's another promise we can make. It will change and it will not always be good. So there's 2 commitments we got today.
Well, one thing I really identified with there from what you just said too was the expectation of practice, right? And I told you this was going to come back to football because we talked about football before, and just any type of thing that you're doing. It can be whatever it is that you're doing. Like, practice is always different than the real thing, right? Whenever, I do a lot of things where, and I've talked about this with certain CFOs where it's like, yeah, I practice having difficult conversations with people. I practice how to handle certain things. I'll do it. I don't like to fly, so I take a lot of road trips. I spend a lot of times on road trips talking to myself, running through situations, running through scenarios. How would I handle this? How would I handle that? I probably look like a lunatic to somebody who's either thinking I'm blasting show tunes and singing to myself or whatever it is. But even though I do all of that preparation, nothing prepares you for the real thing. And so you've got to put yourself out there and get yourself the repetitions in having difficult conversations, getting prepared. And sometimes no matter how well you're prepared, you're going to fall flat. And you've got to learn how to handle that too. That goes back to the psychology of not letting that get in the way of your growth. Yeah, so I really like that piece of it.
There's so many gold mines in that. I'm going to take this football analogy a step further.
Let's do it.
Tom Brady arguably is the best quarterback that was, or ever will be to some. Now, if you're a Pat Mahomes fan, I get it. He's on his way there too, right?
He's got to do it for 10 more years to kind of be in the conversation, but yeah.
What was it? The Patriots, Falcons, and the Patriots are behind 28 points at halftime.
Mm-hmm.
That's tough right there. And I guarantee you they did not script that in their practice.
No.
But looking forward, they didn't change who they were. They didn't scrap the playbook. They went back to the same fundamentals that they had been doing forever and just executed at a higher level. So you're on to something in that failure in the moment is kind of what you make it.
Mm-hmm.
That cemented Tom Brady's legacy, love him or hate him, as one of the best. And then he still won more games. But in that moment, he didn't quit. He didn't walk away. He didn't say, "Oh, I retire at halftime." And that's this mentality I think we need to embrace in the business world. It's not as combative. It's not as frustrating, but there will be ups, there will be downs. How you choose to embrace it. What's the strategy in the moment? He knew how to take a snap, whether it was under center or from shotgun. That's what he was going to do every single snap, whether he was trailing 400 points or trailing by 3 with 2 minutes left. It's the same routines. So this repetition is we crave as accountants. Why not go do it again?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. We really do. I feel like we've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable in order to really succeed in having long-term success with these types of conversations. I think I saw in your bio, Chris, that you are an insurance producer. I too am an insurance producer. I have that as a part of my story and my background. I was on the phone, like we were trying to talk through like some life insurance policies with some clients, and we were trying to sell them some things, like, let's be real. And it was new for me. I was really new, and I was listening to another friend of mine who I've worked with, and she was on the phone with somebody. I'm like, I really liked how she like posed that, how she presented it. Like, that was really, really good. So I got on the phone. I tried to do the exact same thing, say it the exact same way, and it was awful. Like, it was like I stumbled through my words. Like, I was like, that felt so uncomfortable. And I guess at that point, like, I could have easily said, like, I'm done. I'm just going to give it to her. She can handle it. But from that point, I was like, okay, I need to make it a little more me. And then the next conversation got better. And then the next conversation got better. And suddenly I was closing all kinds of policies by the end of it. But it just, so part of that speaks to, I tell that story to speak to what you spoke about, getting in the room with people, just listening to them doing it. You can learn so much from just spending time with people. Just be a sponge in that. And yes, you may go try to replicate what they do and fall flat on your face because it may not just fit exactly, your style or your language or whatever that is, but that doesn't mean that you don't keep trying. And our brains, I think, naturally want to keep us safe. Like, talking about like that fight or flight, like naturally our brains want to like keep us in that safe space. So like whenever we start to get uncomfortable, our brains are like, retreat, danger, back away. But we've got to just make a conscious effort just to keep pushing and keep going. And that's where it can get hard, because sometimes you make a decision in the moment to say, this isn't for me, I'm done. Or you can make a decision to push forward and be on the front end of the change curve that we all know is coming.
Well, in a beautiful illustration that's inside of that, I'm teasing about like, go get psychology books, go get a meditation book. And in this moment, I mean, we've all had the conversation where we start to get hot. Mm-hmm. And your face is red and you're about to lose it because it's like the 38th time you've explained to the client that that's not how it works. Take a breath. And those disciplines apply here. And what we've said, be comfortable in the discomfort that is. There's a lot of different ways, but the reality boils back to be present, be adaptable. I've learned over the years, sometimes hey, I need a minute. I didn't expect that. That kind of struck me different. And prepare somebody for, hey, I may blurt out stupidities next. I don't know. I'm working on the fly. But the authenticity in the brainstorm, I think, develops people with deeper relationships in most instances. Now, you can't be wrong in that scenario. I've got these beautiful colors behind me, and we always use them as analogies. If I'm talking blue and you're talking red, it's a miss later. But there is, hey, which of the colors over here, red, orange, or a variation thereof, that was pretty close. So I think the degrees matter inside of that. But I want to end on, so what if you are wrong? You're allowed to be wrong every now and then. Mm-hmm. Just admit it, own it, and move on to the next and correct it. I think that's hard for people, and it gives kind of that natural just take a breath and say, you know what? I don't think I understood this correctly. Help me see what you see. Most clients.
Well, I think that's.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I was going to follow up and say I think that's challenging for our generation and our Gen Z friends in particular too, because thinking about. And I read this great book that was talking about like the millennial experience in America and like how changes in college and how those types of things changed our understanding of things like grades and success and how we measure success with being right, because that's how society is going to measure our success. Like our brains have been completely rewired. And I had this wonderful conversation with a professor of mine at K-State named Dan Fisher. Hannah, I've talked to you about Dr. Fisher a lot. And he kind of revolutionized my thinking on this, where he said, look, I don't want the grade to be the end all be all. Like that's a measuring stick. That is not a value proposition. And I think our generation and generations below us need to continue to refine and change our definition of what it means to be incorrect. That in and of itself is not a binary yes or no value proposition of who you are as a person. It's a reflection of where you are in that moment. It's a balance sheet, not an income statement. It can change tomorrow. And having some permission to play in that space, I hope might help people be like, look, it's perfectly okay to create a thesis and go into a conversation. Hannah, I was thinking about you in particular when you are going in and sitting into the room and you have a thesis and you're like, I think we should do this. And the person you're shadowing goes a completely different way. In that moment, you were wrong. But your opportunity in that moment is to go talk to that advisor and say, hey, I thought we were going to go this way. You went this way. What did you see that I didn't see? And help me understand. If you can solve that second piece, you will become a great advisor, because that's the mentality and the thought process that you need to take is have a thesis. If you're wrong, figure out what that other person saw that you didn't see. Maybe you bring that situation, you say, hey, I saw this. And that person's like, oh man, we probably should have gone that direction. Those are wonderful conversations. That's okay. I want to hear those conversations from people.
And this is that space for communication. And communication is probably the hardest thing we do. Mm-hmm. I like verbal communication when I give instructions. Yeah. So oftentimes I'm like, hey, what part of blue do you not understand? And then the people on the other side are like, well, are we talking, Kansas blue, since we're having a little fun with Kansas State earlier? Or are we talking North Carolina blue? Or are we talking Kentucky blue? But in that bubble, it matters. But you've got to create that space. And what I think you're both alluding to with these stories, which is beautiful, is there's a style to communication that is not one way, it's two way, and it's ever changing. Important to embrace.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it is. And you've just got to be able to adapt. You've got to be able to read. Another thing is like reading the room too is another thing that's like taken me a while. Just like getting in the room, reading it, understanding like when I do need to take a different direction, when I need to change paths, instead of like getting in the room and saying, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm following. And then suddenly I see my client's like eyes glaze over. And I'm like, yeah, we need a shift here. We need to shake things up and we need to take this a different direction. Earlier in my career, I would have just like stuck to the path, stuck to the plan, not deviated from it. Whenever now I'm like, okay, I can sense that pretty quickly. I know whenever I need to pivot. I know whenever I might need to improv something or throw a question at them to get them paying attention. But some of that just takes time. It just takes doing it. It takes listening to other people do it, and it'll happen, but you have to be really intentional about that.
When I was a young gun, this is a funny story. If the person that hears this story knows it, they listen to the podcast, they're going to laugh because they know exactly what was going on. But I was in technician mode, taking diligent notes, writing everything down, doing all the stuff. They figured it out and started telling me nonsense. Oh, no. And I just kept taking notes. in my head, I was like, they're kind of nuts, but I didn't have the courage to say it because I was trained, get the info from the client, right? And then finally she stops me and she was like, Chris, yes. What did I just say? And I repeat it back to her. She's like, does that make sense? I'm like, not really, no. And she's like, for the last 10 minutes, I've been feeding you junk. You're supposed to laugh, man. Oh, we've all been there. But remember, if the client senses you're in that mode, sometimes in this scenario, I'm glad she goofed with me because it's a beautiful story to tell to people, but they don't want that version of you either. Nor do you. I mean, but therein lies some of the fun with it. Sometimes stories are going to be complete nonsense. And you're going to say, really? You dreamed that up? Maybe they're going to be the next whoever, but maybe they're not. I tease people and say statistics are that you're not. So I'm going to bring you back to a place of statistical soundness. But if you want to be the next eccentric whoever, I'm behind you 100%. I will be there every step of the way telling you why you probably shouldn't do it like that.
And you can tell me I was wrong when you get there, right?
I will be the first to take it. I'll say I was wrong. You don't even need to tell me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. One of the challenges with Hannah and I, of the many hats we wear around here, sometimes we get involved in some training and we have in our onboarding process certain deliverables and things that, obviously like you need to hit this. And there's one meeting in particular where it's kind of our first opportunity to meet the client. And one of the asks from the team is like, well, can I get like an agenda of how that call should go? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I can give you that. But I'll tell you this. If you don't follow anything on this agenda and you get none of these answers, but you spent 60 minutes having a great conversation with the client and you learned a lot and you interacted and you bonded and you did all those things, that's a more successful outcome than if you hit every single one of these questions and sounded like a robot and the client didn't think you were doing anything. Like it's the number one, I don't want to say mistake, but the number one thing that I see from folks who are still learning that advisory piece of the business is, man, when the client tells you an interesting nugget, dig in, be like, oh, hey, that sounds interesting. Tell me a little bit more about that. That seems like a pretty key thing for you. Can we dive in? I want to put this to the side and I want to hone in on this because that's obviously important to you. Therefore, it's important to me too. Kind of divorcing ourselves from that technician side and being like, no, just have the conversation. If you need to have a second meeting because you need to figure out what their AR aging looks like, cool, do that later. If you've got the client talking, take advantage.
Well, this is that people remember how you've made them feel moment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's few arenas where people will be as vulnerable as you're talking about, but you got to give them the opportunity to do it.
Mm-hmm. No, it's true. Your comment about being the most trusted advisor they're going to have, you've got access to everything. I remember back when I was doing some financial planning too. It's like, I've got all of your wills. I've got your entire estate plan. I've got all of these different things. I have your business QuickBooks. I have all of your personal financials. I see your bank statements.
Yeah.
I know everything. Thank you for trusting me with it. But also, that's scary, and we need to acknowledge it.
For me, I giggle when a client locks up and won't maybe be as candid as they should. And we have the same conversation you just illustrated.
Yeah.
I can see everything else, but you don't want to tell me, go ahead. What is it? I promise it's a safe space. The hard ones are when finances are going in a direction that are unanticipated. When everybody's making money, nobody cares. But when it's tight or we've got to make a difficult decision, A, nobody talks about that socially, so there is no context. And then B, how do you even begin what could be an emotional breakdown? I mean, folks are going to naturally avoid some of that stuff, but that's where we're going back to kind of what you're saying, lean into. How does that make you feel? I heard what you said, then you went completely somewhere else. Let's go back to that for a moment. Why did you say that? I don't know why it fit into the conversation. Now you've at least opened the door to maybe get some more feedback. Because people will give you opportunities. I mean, just think like your buddies when you call them on the way home, and both of you are in the car hands free, right, and safely driving. And then all of a sudden they go off on a tangent, and somebody cut in front of them, and then they'll start telling you about how a terrible day, and you're like, how did we make this transition? But that's the same thing you're trying to recreate somewhere else. But when it's your buddy, it's a safe space. When it's your advisor, I might be the smartest person in the room when I'm being a physician, but perhaps I make bad financial decisions and now I need to sell something. Or, I mean, we've all been in the scenario where family life wasn't what it was supposed to be. And the financial strains made that worse, and nobody would come to the table to talk about it. It's tough because business and family all bleed together sometimes.
I still remember the hardest conversation I had to have with a family member was like, hey, your kids are going off to college. We have to have a conversation about documentation for if the worst thing happens to your kid at college. And that led to an entirely different conversation about feeling unsettled in other parts of their estate plan that they did not feel comfortable talking about until we broached the subject. And it was, at the end of the day, an incredibly empowering conversation for us, because as an advisor, it allowed us to take that holistic view, which I think we all agree is important for advisors. We've got to see the whole picture because, what we do over here might impact over here. And it's nice to know that as much of the picture as we can. But yeah, it took a very interesting turn that we didn't realize we needed to go down. But man, once we got there, it was really kind of cool.
Are they still a client today?
This was at an old firm, but I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are still a client. And it reminds me of what the guy I was working with at the time said, is like, you have in your opportunities in life, in the life cycle of a client, 1 to 3 opportunities to make a real difference for them. Yeah. Take advantage.
I think that illustration, and whether they're with you or another firm, is irrelevant here. The impact you made is an opportunity. We have a similar story where I just happened to take a phone call on a holiday, and there was a person diagnosed with cancer, needed an estate plan, need it now. It's like, cool, I'll come in tomorrow morning. If you'll give me the basics, I'll bang the thing out and we'll get everybody together. And lifetime client. I mean, this is generational where we're grandparents have now passed, and then we got the parents and then the grandkids, and everything's kind of rolling through. But it's a beautiful illustration of when you step in and help people and create space to help people. I could have stood firm and been like, well, you haven't filled out my form yet. That's maybe a scope creep issue, but so what? Sometimes folks need help. And in this scenario, there was no chance they were going to fill out the form. All of this was evolving way too fast, but it's an opportunity to step up. And I had a law school professor who talked about servant leadership. And there's a lot of people that sit in these licensed professional roles that sometimes struggle because there's not always that greater connection. You know, they feel like it's a transactional about the almighty dollar. And sometimes you got to step up. And the best way to get your constituency with you is to recognize you have the skill set. Lead them to the conclusion they need. Don't force, but lead. Very, very different scenarios. But his point was there's a lot of lucky people that are licensed. Behave as if you deserve that honor. Don't take it for granted. And I think that's kind of the beauty of what we all try to do. There's no checklist for that.
Mm-mm. I feel like it's really unfortunate that there's people who are just in this for like the transactional piece or just have that expectation. And I mean, I feel like the majority of my fulfillment in this role are the connections that I get to make with people, the relationships that I get to establish, and seeing some of that come full circle has been amazing. Like, it's just truly been one of the most fulfilling things and keeps me going on the really hard days, because there have been hard days. Like, I've had a client make me cry before. Like, I had to literally on Zoom turn my camera off because they were being so mean to me at the moment. And as much as I wanted to like be like, y'all can have this guy, I'm out of here, like, figure it out, I stuck with it. And I was like, you know what, like, he clearly has something bigger going on. And I'm glad he feels like he has enough trust with me to be this firm, I guess, because this guy's been a client for a while. He ended up selling his business a couple of years later, and then wrote me like the kindest recommendation letter, like, to the firm. And I was like, what a 180-degree turn we have taken here from you making me cry to where we ended up now. And it was just a full circle moment of just how happy I was that I stuck it out. I just continued pushing forward in the relationship, and just like I did lean in and knew that he had some bigger like health and life stuff going on at the time too that was playing into this, and it wasn't personal, and just taking that step back was really awesome. So I'd hate for somebody to miss that. Like, don't miss that opportunity to build those relationships and get fulfillment in that way, because I mean, maybe there's people in this world that get fulfillment in just like the mundane, like just pushing out journal entries and bank recs. Like, that isn't me. So maybe there's people that are. So I really hope that people can grasp onto that and find that in some way in any role in this industry.
Well, different paths for different folks.
That's right.
One thing that I think is really, really important inside of the story you're telling there is, I'll share this with anybody that's in a client relationship role. If you think for a minute that reaction was about you, you're nuts. They gave it no thought to how it impacted you.
That's right.
And I don't mean that to belittle the other side. It's just reality. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about you. It was about them, and it was 1,000% about them, which is why you got the reaction that you got. And your intuitiveness kicked in there and said, I know there was something more than, and look where it led us. Right? Those are the rewarding moments, especially when they were sour.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So to speak to your earlier point about it's not going to be all rainbows and butterflies, I am living proof that it's not going to be all rainbows and butterflies with your clients, and just how things shift in their own personal lives that do affect the work that we do for them. So, Chris, I cannot thank you enough for coming on here and having this conversation with us. This has been such a great conversation that I hope that our listeners can get a ton of value from. If anybody's listening to this podcast and wants to connect with you outside of the podcast, how do they do that?
A couple of different ways. Search for my name, Christopher Papin, on LinkedIn. There's all kinds of free materials out there that we post to LinkedIn. So kind of wherever you are, professional, advisor, or client, any of the above, there's good stuff there. Or CPA firm website, papincpa.com. We're always willing to talk to folks. It doesn't have to be like a client relationship. We're looking to meet good people like you guys that are trying to impact and change other folks. And I find when you play in that sandbox, it'll take care of itself. It doesn't matter about the rest of it in the business, everything else. Just meet good people and everything takes care of itself. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you guys.
If you're a young CPA looking to develop in their careers, we're always looking for great people. Visit our website for remote work opportunities with Summit Virtual CFO, or find all our open positions at Anders CPAs and Advisors.